this is called a lecture, but really I'm hoping we can have some fun. I am wanting to start off, though, by finding out, just out of interest, how many people in this room were born in Russia? Wow, look at that. How many people have relatives who are from Russia? So quite a few. How many of you have been to Russia? Wow. How many of you are planning to go to Russia? How many of you have worked in Russia? My goodness. How many of you have worked in Russia but just didn't want to put up your hands? Okay. So I've got a few pictures, and then maybe we're going to have a chat. So I look forward to it, especially in light of how many of you have been to Russia. So in fact, most of you know that this is not Russia. Although for many people it is. And yes, that's the T-shirt I wear in the evenings on the streets. There is so much more to this country. I don't have to tell many of you, but those of you who haven't been there, it is quite a remarkable place. And I think what I want to do tonight is really share some images. I would like to try and dispel some myths. I'd also like to talk a little bit about some of the planning lessons that I've been taking from Vancouver to Russia, but also talk about some of the things that I've seen in Russia that might indeed be brought back to Vancouver. So that's basically the outline that I propose for this evening. I'd like to start with a personal story. We're then going to take the cruise from Moscow to Saint Petersburg. Then we'll go to Moscow. We'll learn a little bit about this very, very interesting competition that was organized. And I'd like to recognize Gaetan Wai in the audience, because many of you are going to say, my God, this was quite an imposing position. How did you ever get it? And it was Gaetan who put my name forward. I'm going to take you to Sochi just before the Olympics. Then we'll go to Saint Petersburg, and then to Kazan, and that's where we'll finish off. So for those of you who are not Russian, whose families are not Russian, I would just like you to take a couple of minutes and learn the alphabet. So if you could study that, so you know which is the G. Okay, so that's the L, the R. The R looks like a P. Okay, so here's the test. Which of these seats is my seat? There you are. The one, this is Michael Geller, exactly. Yeah, it's simple. There you go. So I've been about 8 times now, and for those at the back, it says you know you're ill when you start to look like your passport photo. And my family said, no, I hope you're not going to just show people pictures of yourself. I said, of course I'm going to show people pictures of myself. So a couple of these I will explain, and some of them cannot be explained. My family came from Odessa, and at the time it was Russia. Today it's Ukraine. And often I would meet people by the name Geller, and I would ask them, where did your family come from? Invariably, they said, our family's from Odessa. This prompted me one day to say to my father, who was 82 at the time, what do you think? There's seats at the front here if you would like to sit down. What do you think of the idea that we'll go to Odessa? I found there was a cruise, and as I say here, Odessa was Vancouver's sister city, and after the question and answer, I can explain how that came about. And Philibone wrote this nice letter, and I told everybody on the cruise ship that when we arrived in Odessa, there would either be a very large limousine waiting for my dad and I, or there wouldn't be. And there wasn't. But we'd hooked up with another family from Los Angeles, and they'd arranged for a car and a driver, and so we decided that we'd split the bill, They would seek out their family roots, I would seek out ours, and then from that we would do our own thing. And as it turned out, neither of us could find our relatives, because the truth is, although I was told my family came from Odessa, I think what it really meant was it's like saying you're from Vancouver, but you're really from Chilliwack or Merritt, a long ways away. But notwithstanding that, I took with the letter, I went to City Hall and I showed the letter to somebody, and they invited me up to the mayor's office. And the mayor wasn't there, but the deputy mayor was there. And he didn't speak English, and I didn't speak Ukrainian, but we all spoke a bit of French. And I had brought along some items that I had bought at a little celebration in Vancouver of the 50th anniversary of the Vancouver-Odessa sister city relationship. So I presented the deputy mayor with a button and a T-shirt, and my dad took a picture, and when we got home, he said, "Oh my God, do you realize the mistake you made?" He said, "What?" I said, "Look at that T-shirt. It says Canada, Russia. You don't do that for someone from the Ukraine." Anyway, it was a very nice day. We got back on the ship, and I suddenly said to my dad, "Do you know what we forgot? I completely forgot to check the telephone directory." So 20 years later, I had the opportunity to go back to Odessa and decided to do two things. I stayed at the Bristol Hotel because my family had emigrated from Odessa to Bristol. In fact, it was a nice hotel, and I wondered if that's why they picked Bristol, but sadly I don't know. You should all ask your relatives to tell you about the story of their family while they're still around, because too often you want to ask these questions after they're gone. The other thing I did was travel around with a tourist guide. I was the only tourist in town, but when she learned I was Jewish, she said, that's what she didn't say that. She said, "Did you know Fiddler on the Roof is playing in Odessa?" And I wanted to go because I was so curious to see how they handled the pogroms. This time I didn't forget to try and find a telephone directory, and on TripAdvisor I discovered there was a Jewish museum. So I went to the museum and I asked them, "Do you by any chance have a Odessa telephone directory?" She took me into the corner of her room, and there was a pile of them. And it allowed me to ask the question I'd been wanting to ask for 20 years. "Could you please check and see how many Gellers there are in the Odessa telephone directory?" And she did. And you now know how to read my name, so you can see there's a few of them there. And I was so excited about this, I got back to the hotel and I posted a comment on TripAdvisor. And when I was preparing another talk, I went onto the Odessa TripAdvisor website and discovered they've actually taken my photo, and it's now a part of the permanent record. So that was so it wasn't until a number of years later that I got a chance to go back, but this time I went to Russia. It was 2007, and as some of you may know, my wife and I took a year off after I finished at SFU City. And we spent 9 months traveling around the world. And this cruise was quite an experience. And it takes about 12, 13 days. If you do it, I'm told that Viking offers a cruise. We took the Russian cruise. I don't want to be disrespectful to the Russian people in the room, but I take the Viking cruise. You get the same performers greeting you at the docks. You get to go past the same incredible sights. And we finally arrived, but we started in Moscow. We arrived in Moscow, and I wanted to get on the subway and see if we could get down to Red Square. And I have to tell you, midnight in Moscow and Red Square really is quite spectacular. And I don't have to tell those of you who've been there. By the way, if you haven't been inside the gum department store, I mean, that's the old government department store there. That's what it looks like inside. At least that's what it looked inside then. It's not what it looked like inside today, because if you were following the news, I gather there was a bomb scare and they had to vacate the whole place. But we traveled along the river, and you go through a whole series of locks, and the architecture really was the kind of architecture many of us think of as true Russian, Soviet architecture. But there were some surprises. So quite an amazing array of building styles and colors. This next complex, some of you may know, it's quite amazing. And if I understand it, you were saying there are no nails, right? That was all done without any nails, just to look at it a little closer. The windmill on the right is interesting, because if you look at the base, you'll realize it's on a revolving base. And that way it's so that it can maximize its exposure to the wind. That's a clever idea. But of course, there's lots of remnants of the old industrial operations up and down the river. But the next thing I came upon was really quite surprising. I saw these totem poles and I thought, my goodness. But I guess at one point we were all one people. This is different. I think when I was there was 2,750 different vodka items, not different kinds of vodka, but bottles shaped like rifles. And they were very proud of the fact that Mr. Putin had been a visitor. But eventually, we made it up to Saint Petersburg. And if you haven't been, you go to the Summer Palace. This has to be one of the most spectacular complexes in the world. I was impressed with all the fountains, but was concerned, having worked up at SFU and become an adjunct professor in the Center for Sustainable Community Development, what is the electrical cost of operating all of these pumps all the time, only to learn that there are no pumps, that this is all done through a series of reservoirs and dams, and as the water is released, that's what creates the fountains. And of course, St. Petersburg is very much a city of water, and so traveling around, cruising down the canals, as many of you may know, a lot of the design was done by Dutch architects, although there was another architect who I will show you in a minute. And it really is quite a spectacular city, especially the heritage area, with some remarkable facilities. This is the Church of Spilt Blood. Inside, it's magnificent. That's all mosaic. But what's interesting is that, of course, for many years, it was closed down. It was not allowed to be used as a religious facility. It was used to store potatoes. And it was really quite derelict for a while, but has been fully restored. I think most of you know this as part of the Hermitage complex, and I could have spent the entire evening just sharing photos of the works that I saw. This is across from the building that we more traditionally associate with the Hermitage. And what was so remarkable here was you wandered through and there were these paintings that you studied in school, but they weren't all cordoned off. There weren't guards. I went into one room and there must have been a dozen Renoirs. I couldn't believe it. Finally, I found someone who spoke English and Russian. I said, I need to speak to one of the guards. Like, there's no security here, or it doesn't appear to be. I finally found someone. I said, do you not realize, like, why is there so little security? And she said something, and he translated to me. She says, they're not particularly good Renoirs. One of the things I noticed traveling around Europe was often in cities, people would make these wonderful bronze plaques of what a particular place looked like at a point in time. And I've often thought it's something we should do in our city to celebrate neighborhoods and so forth. But the interesting thing about St. Petersburg is that in some neighborhoods, as this plaque shows, it's over 100 years old. Nothing has really changed in 100 years. One of the interesting outings we had in St. Petersburg was we took a night tour. And the night tour was to watch all the bridges opening. Because during the day, they can't, of course, to keep the traffic, but at night when all the boats need to move through, and we boarded a bus. They give everybody a little plastic cup when you get on, and you wonder, what's this for? And then as the evening goes on and it gets darker and darker, somebody walks up and down the bus with a bottle of vodka. That's a good vodka. So 6 years later, in 2013, I got the opportunity, thanks to Gaetan, to go back to Russia to serve as a juror for a competition. And this was a competition to basically create in Moscow what London had created at Canary Wharf, the concept being a whole new financial center. And the sponsor of the competition was Sberbank. And Sberbank, as many of you know, is the largest bank in Russia. And they looked after us. And I have to tell you, I could not help but sit in my hotel room in the Kempinski Bolshuk Hotel overlooking the Kremlin and think it wasn't that long ago my grandparents were run out of this country by the grandparents of the people who are looking after me today. So I had another glass of vodka. I was trying to figure what are the right words to describe Moscow, and when we get into the Q&A, hopefully you'll all help me. But I use the word overwhelming. I mean, at times it's depressing, but it is overwhelming. The scale of things is quite magnificent. I mean, as soon as Gordon Price sees the next slide, he's going to say, that street needs to go on a diet. And looking out of the boardroom of Sberbank at the top, you see the sort of more typical housing that's been built over the years. And a lot of this housing, of course, has deteriorated, and some of you may correct me, but my understanding is some of these older buildings that were built by the government, at a certain point, the residents were actually offered their suites at no cost. Unlike England, where they had to buy them, here they were given them. And what was interesting to me is that a number of residents did not accept the units. They didn't want them. They were so used to renting, they wanted to continue renting. At least that's what I was told. You can tell me if that's true. Again, the whole question of Russia and energy, I mean, this looks quite different to me than downtown Vancouver, just as this looks quite different. But the fact is, you can go around Moscow and see some of the most amazing sights, especially in winter. This next picture, I just rested my camera on the railing of a bridge and turned out like that. I can't figure out what the blue lights are, but in the winter, it is cold. This is near the Kremlin, as some of you know. Again, one of the most remarkable buildings in the world. And a cathedral, the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, which, of course, for a period of time was not a cathedral. And some of you may recall that this cathedral was in the news because this is where Pussy Riot decided to perform for Vladimir. He was not amused. I presented some of these slides to a discussion group I belonged to on Tuesday, and former Archbishop Michael Ingham was there, and he said, you know, it's interesting. Russia is opening up right now about 2 religious facilities a month, and Canada is closing down about 2 religious facilities a month. So which religion really is doing the most for religion? This is the Metropole Hotel, one of the grand old hotels near the Kremlin. And I was going to stay on for a few extra days, and I wanted a different experience. And I saw that it had a swimming pool, and I was eating and drinking too much, so I decided to stay there for 3 or 4 nights. And one day, as I was going by the concierge, they asked me how I was enjoying my stay, and I told them I was very much enjoying my stay. I said, the only thing I regret is your swimming pool is closed. Oh, yes, she said, I'm sorry, it's closed for repairs. I said, you know, it's understandable, but you might want to maybe put that on the website just in case somebody like me wanted to come and stay and have a swim. She said, look, I apologize, but would you be available to join us for tea later this afternoon? Oh, I said, I'm sure I would. So this is the tea they set out for me. Just me. I wanted to go out into the streets and just look for pretty young ladies and say, are you an architect? Would you like to come and have tea with me? One of the most beautiful sights in Moscow is the subway. You've read about it. The stations on the top left there is not all of them are like that, but many are like that. But you go around and it really is quite magnificent. And I could just spend the next hour showing you pictures of stations because I did take advice in my guidebook and I took one of the lines and I got off at every stop and all I could think of is this sure is different than the Canada line. And in fact, I say that, I really do think more of an effort should be made to improve the design of our stations. I remember the Montreal Metro was my first exposure to a subway where they'd made an effort, and it was beautiful. And it doesn't take as much money as some like to think. It's a tragedy, I think. I think the 49th and Cambie SkyTrain station has to be one of the most disgusting pieces of public design. And I mentioned this, and somebody from Langara College came up to me and said, I agree with you, but don't worry, our students are going to compete to design works which will be put up on the wall. And the next time you're at 49th and Cambie, take a look at the Langara students' work that's currently on the wall. Anyway, we won't go on about that. Instead, I'd like to talk about the Seven Sisters. The Seven Sisters were referred to as skyscrapers, truly in the Stalinist style. And they really are, I don't think I know why they were called sisters, but there were 7 buildings spread around Moscow. And this is the one that I got to know most intimately because it's now a Radisson hotel, a Radisson Blue hotel. And to give you what kind of hotel it is, in the lobby is the Rolls-Royce dealership. But I read on TripAdvisor, I looked to see interesting things to do in Moscow in January, and one of the things it said is take a river cruise. And I thought, I mean January, not July. No, it said take a river cruise. So I Googled it, and sure enough, I discovered there is a river cruise in January. So I took it. And it's an icebreaker. And you go up and down, and they give you nice hot drinks and headphones to tell you what's going on. And it is quite an experience. Just out of interest, how many of you have taken the Moscow River Cruise in winter? All right, well, if anybody goes and does it, could you please bring me back another hat? Because I proudly wore that hat, and I lost it in London. The Four Seasons Hotel, one of the nice hotels of Moscow. What's so interesting about this building is that it's not a new building. As it says, it's a replica of the old Moscow hotel. But there's a better story. I invite all of you to take a close look at this building, especially on the east side and the west side, where you'll note that there is no symmetry. And the story, as I understand it, goes like this. The architect had 2 different design ideas, and he decided he would leave it up to Mr. Stalin to decide which one he liked, because most architects do know which side of the bread is buttered. And Stalin signed the document right in the middle, so not knowing which side he wanted, they built both sides. That's kind of a good story. Again, at night, you can just go around and look, and it's quite magnificent. What isn't quite so beautiful, though, is some of the housing. And what is interesting is a lot of people, when they take their apartment, if they want to expand their space, they expand their space. They don't have to deal with the strata council. They don't have to check the condominium bylaws. And so I do use pictures like this as an explanation as to why perhaps condominium bylaws are not necessarily such an evil thing. But some of the other new condominium housing and multifamily housing that I saw around Moscow is quite amazing. I mean, these are obviously homes for the well-to-do, but they're quite impressive. They're beautifully detailed. Some buildings are a little larger than what we're used to, but there is a certain style. One of the things, though, that I did discover, and this does happen in Toronto a little bit, is I looked at some of the new buildings, but I couldn't tell if they really were new buildings or old buildings that had been renovated. This, in fact, was a new building. And this looks to me like older buildings that have been renovated, but somebody said, no, this was about an 8-year-old building. So who knows? I'll give you another insight into this. What is, though, absolutely clear is this is a new building. This is a new office complex, and indeed, it reminded me very much of some of the office buildings I see in Beijing. Now, this next picture will surprise some of you because this is the downtown financial center of Moscow with a few look-at-me buildings. So the next time you go up Georgia Street and you look at the Vancouver twist, I want you to see how much it twists compared to this building that is also the twist. But it's an interesting collection of magnificent buildings, and some of you recognize, I think Rem Koolhaas must have done that one, or if he didn't, he should take whoever did it to court. But I thought this was quite a beautiful building. You can't see it at the back, but those are trees that have been somehow stenciled into the glass. Very, very beautiful. But the question is, will all of these beautiful buildings result in a major financial center? And in doing a little bit of research for this talk, I came across this following chart in which people were being asked, how long will it take for Moscow to become a leading financial center? And that purple at the right is never. But it was this desire to create a financial center that led to this competition for a 1,000-acre greenfield site truly on the outskirts of Moscow. In fact, the boundary of the city was modified so that this property could fall within the city limits. And the competition was organized by a company or a nonprofit called Strelka. And maybe Gaetan or others will tell you about Strelka, but it's quite an interesting institution that was founded by one of the oligarchs who's provided money to help educate architects and people interested in media and design. But it also runs research programs, and one of the things that it does is it runs competitions. And this is its facility in the heart of the city, in an area that's, I'm not sure if this is the renovated chocolate factory, but near the chocolate factory. And if you look there, yes, that looks like a rainbow crosswalk. So this is, if you like, a special little part of Moscow with some very bright, educated, and interesting people. And they put together a competition brief for this competition, as well as managed the whole process. And it was a two-stage competition. Initially, everybody was invited to submit their credentials. Interestingly, the only Vancouver or Canadian firm was Perkins and Will through their London affiliate, but nobody else in Canada. A number of American firms, as you will see, but well over 130 firms, incredible teams. And I'll show you some of the work in a minute. But now I'd like to show you my new friend. At this competition, I made a new friend. There was a man sitting on the jury. We were a jury of 14, 9 Russians and 5 international jurors. Myself, someone from Korea, somebody from Germany, somebody from London, and somebody from France. And I noticed after the first day's deliberations that there was one Russian member of the jury who seemed to be held up in a fairly high regard. And this next picture explains why. No, Mr. Putin wasn't on the jury, but the man beside him was. And that man is Alexander Voloshin. And Mr. Voloshin used to be Yeltsin's chief of staff. He was part of the family. And when Putin was selected to take over, he became Putin's chief of staff. So not wanting to be seen as an opportunist, I did go up to him and say, "Sir, could we have our picture taken together?" And I carry that picture with me in my wallet whenever I walk the streets of Moscow. I had the opportunity this morning, thanks to CBC, to chat with Stephen Quinn about tonight's talk. And one of the aspects that he was interested in is, what did I think were the lessons that I could bring back from Russia to Canada? And one of the things that intrigued me, and I'll be interested from others here who've dealt more with this than I have, the Russian norms and regulations are quite standardized, and some might say they're quite heavy-handed, but I found them quite intriguing. For instance, on the left side there, that is about how many hours of uninterrupted sunlight should a room get in an apartment. So I phoned Roger Hughes on the way over to ask him, "Roger, do you think about how much sunlight?" Roger said, "I think about the view." And indeed, that's what we often think about in Vancouver. But those of us, especially when we're getting older, sunlight becomes a very important thing. And if any of you are interested in any of the images in this presentation, I'll be happy to send them to you. One of the other things that impressed me was the attention that's given to childcare and kindergartens. And am I right? Kindergartens are actually separated from elementary schools, at least in some instances, and the developers are building the kindergartens and childcare as part of their projects. And so what this goes on about is the capacity, how many square meters per child, how far the childcare and kindergarten facilities should be from the housing, and so forth. And I think I'll touch on this again later, I think there's some interesting notions here about, since we're soon going to get rid of our minimum parking requirements, maybe we can replace them with some of these other requirements that perhaps do enhance livability. So the competition was impressive. As I say, we had over 130 submissions. 8 teams were narrowed down, and each was paid 200,000 euros to develop their ideas. So 1.6 million euros worth of planning by these 8 teams, some of whose names you recognize. Some of them you don't. Some were partnerships between Russian and international firms. Others were purely international teams. But some very impressive work put together. And a lot of this is online at the Moscow International Financial Center. I just wanted to show you, this is a submission by SOM and one of the larger Russian firms. And I mean, it really did get quite detailed in terms of thinking not just about pretty pictures, but how would this all be phased? And indeed, if any of you are ever working on large-scale planning projects, I think it's essential that you give a lot of attention to how they're going to be phased. Too often I look at a picture of the overall site and I say, what will it look like when the first phase is complete? And they say, oh, we haven't quite got to that yet. I think it's really important that you get to that as you're doing the design. And indeed, it was one of the things that I tried to impress on both this Moscow and Kazan jury, and indeed, it was done. The winners of the competition were Astok, and quite a conglomeration of people. However, shortly after the competition ended, Mr. Putin invaded the Ukraine. And that really was the end of this proposed international financial center, at least for the time being. So I left Moscow. I happened to arrive in Moscow just before Sochi Olympics. And I never dreamt that I would get to go to Sochi when they were doing the handing over of the baton in 2010. So now I'd like to take you to Sochi. That's how it looked flying in. That's my photo from the plane. And it's hard to believe the Winter Olympics are happening here. It's also hard to believe that many people want to be on that beach. But there's a wonderful promenade, and it is parts of Sochi, a very, very beautiful place. But as I was walking along the waterfront walkway, I noticed that people were doing something I never see them doing in Cole Harbor. And I went up to them and I said, "Do you speak English?" And they said, "Little." I said, "What are you doing?" "Oh," they said, "this is very good for your skin. These little fish, what do you call them? You know, they nibble at the dry skin." And my doctor's in the room. Afterwards, he's going to say, "Michael, I hope you didn't put your feet in there." But from down below, I got invited by Sparebank because not only were they the client for the competition, they were the lead sponsor for the Olympics. And so they invited me to come up and see Krasnaya, Polyana Krasnaya, which was the mountain part, the Whistler part. So I took the train. It was an interesting experience because initially they said they'd send a car for me, but I'd read in the paper the train was going to start. It was the second day of the train. What was a little scary was I just got on the train, and when the train door opened, I was ready to run out because I was a bit late, and there right in front of the door was my host, which made me realize, of course, that someone had been following me all the way from my hotel to the train station, into the bathroom, out of the bathroom. So this is Sochi. This is their version of Whistler. And they were very proud of the fact that they were creating a European-style village. But what they were really proud of was a new shopping center they were building. And Mr. Kuznetsov took me up to the top where they had this huge domed area. Has anybody been to Sochi since the Olympics finished? So have you been up in here?
No, there, but in
Okay. So over in the corner of the room, in the back of the room, you might see, I don't dare try and do it with the pointer, some bags. And he said to me, Stanislav said, "Do you know what's in those bags?" I said, "No." We walked over and he put his hand in. He says, "It's white sand from the Maldives." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because this is all going to become a beach." Yeah. And so there are a number of swimming pools, and the rest of it is a beach, and it's all on the top of this very, very high-end shopping center. And it'll be interesting to see what the room rates are in May. He took me to the top of the ski jump, and I got to tell you, I'm absolutely petrified taking this picture. But anyway, I cropped it so it looks more dramatic than it really was. But I took a whole new interest in the ski jumping event at the Olympics. I kept saying to my wife and kids, I was up there on the top. I said to him, though, "Stanislav, where's the snow?" "Oh," he says, "there'll be snow. There'll be snow. There'll be snow." So we're now in the gondola going up, and this is like Whistler Village on different levels. And so we're now looking down and then further down below, and finally at the top, we found the snow. And he took me in there, and I'd mentioned to him that I love vodka and I love herring, and He had arranged, the place was closed, it hadn't opened yet, but he arranged for a big plate of vodka and herring. But I thought, I've already shown enough pictures of myself. I better leave that one out. I'd like to tell you about the Moscow Urban Forum. The Moscow Urban Forum is an organization that is very interested in planning. And it is looking at research from all over the world in an effort to try and help improve the future design of the city. And they publish these publications, and they're available and they're online, and a lot of it is in English, and I think it's very good. And in September, they organized a session in Saint Petersburg. I actually got invited to speak at about 6 or 7 different sessions all over Russia, and I just wasn't sure. But anyway, I certainly wanted to go to the one in St. Petersburg. And St. Petersburg, for those who haven't been there, really is a magnificent city. And I want to thank Vince Tan for this picture. Vince is a developer with Ayala Land, and this is his impression of every architect. In fact, Vince, I tried to blow up the smirk on his face, but the resolution just wasn't good enough. But St. Petersburg is indeed a fantastic city. St. Isaac's, this was just across the street from the hotel where we were staying and where we were doing our presentation. And I could just spend hours taking photographs as the sun rised and as the sun set. And a lot of these buildings look pretty good on the outside. But the interesting thing was that this conference was being organized in part to talk about how to improve the heritage restoration of St. Petersburg. And I must admit, I appreciated the irony that I was being invited from Vancouver to speak to a fairly august gathering on what they might do. But as it turned out, they weren't so foolish in inviting me, because while these buildings do look great outside, a lot of the insides have not been restored. This is still okay. So I put together a presentation called Heritage Revitalization in the Sustainable City, Lessons from Vancouver. And I sent them my presentation, and it included things like Tudor Manor, where some of you may know on Beach Avenue, we were able to keep an older building by allowing a tower to come out of the middle. I even showed them the proposal for the CP station across the road and the building there, just to show them that not everything that happens in Vancouver is wonderful, although the next proposal will be wonderful. I showed them a number of other high-rise, Richard Henriquez's Sylvia Hotel and so forth, and they made me take out all of the photos of high-rises because they want to keep the scale of the old area fairly low. But I talked about heritage registry and heritage banks, density banks, the kind of heritage revitalization agreements that we enter into, pointing out that the goal, certainly in Vancouver, is to the extent possible, use private money to fix up these buildings rather than public money. And after I sat down, this other gentleman got up, and I have my notes with me. What he said is, the ideas that Mr. Geller is presenting from Vancouver are very interesting. But of course, they would never work in a corrupt country like ours. So I then went off after the conference to take a look at housing around St. Petersburg. And they too have a wonderful subway system. And what's remarkable about that system is not just the art and the stations, but some of those stations are 100 meters below ground. And if you want to think of that another way, that's 30 stories below ground. So I have a habit, sometimes I just get on the subway. This usually works. It works everywhere except in Japan. I just get on, or I buy a ticket, and they'll say, "Where do you want to go?" I say, "Anywhere." And then I get off. In Japan, they refuse to believe that anyone would want to get on a train and just go anywhere. That didn't work. But as I came out of the station here, and some of you who know St. Petersburg will recognize this, some very interesting new architectural condominium developments. This is a brand new building. I was struggling for the style, but I think it is the Nouveau Riche architectural style. And then just beyond this was a single family subdivision This is a typical St. Petersburg single-family subdivision. And if you want to know why it's gated, may I suggest you read either Red Notice or Once Upon a Time in Russia, and you'll understand why security is important, especially if you're an oligarch. But some of these new developments, I mean, I really was quite impressed with them. And these are small boats. But there actually is a street called Billionaires Row near our site in Moscow. But lest you think everybody lives like that, there is a lot of this sort of thing being built as well. And these are the more typical apartments. And I guess I'm now going to have to go back and ask the architects whether if each of those units does get 2 hours of sunshine every day, uninterrupted. But a lot of these buildings could be here. But this couldn't be here. And that's the boat that takes you, it's a hovercraft that takes you to the Summer Palace. I'm not going to take you inside the Hermitage, but I'd like to take you inside another art museum. I think you'll find this one just as interesting. It's a museum for street art. And every year, artists are invited from all over the world to come to St. Petersburg. It's financed again by another oligarch to create street art. And I'll even use the term graffiti. Although my daughter says, "Dad, you always say you hate graffiti," and I do. But some of this is very, very interesting. But it's temporary because it's done, and then maybe twice each year, all the works are replaced. I'm still trying to figure out this piece, but very, very intriguing. And by coincidence, the young lady who's running the program had been my guide in Moscow a year earlier. And one day, as she took me around, I tried to show my appreciation, and I think it'll be obvious how I did it. So I went on TripAdvisor looking for other things to do in St. Petersburg, off the normal channels, and they suggested that I go here. This is a museum in St. Petersburg presents House Upside Down. And it allowed me to do this. And I'm sure you all know exactly how this works, right? But if you don't, ask James Chang during the question and answer period, and he'll tell you. And the city is magnificent at day, but I think it's even more beautiful at night. And I guess it's in part because the night is long, and there's this desire to really try and bring more life into the city. But the whole heritage area is like this. Everything is lit up. So now I'm going to take you to another city. This is Kazan. How many people have been to Kazan? Well, a few of you. And it's a very, very, this is a bit cheeky. This is a photo I took as the plane was coming in. But in fact, it is I found it to be a very lively and very energetic city to be in. Sometimes referred to as the third capital, it's in the Republic of Tatarstan. And again, a lot of their buildings at the top, these are part of what they call their Kremlin, and a mixture of buildings on the bottom, the train station. Here, a building that was built to celebrate agriculture in the region. That's not particularly noteworthy. What was noteworthy for me is the building's about 4 years old. But there is this desire sometimes to recreate the past. If you look to the left of that, you'll see some new condominiums. The main street of Kazan has now become a pedestrian street, and it's very lively. And you find Starbucks and KFC and all of the businesses that we would often find on a similar pedestrian street. But there's just a bit more color. I mean, even that bus stop sign I thought was pretty interesting. Kazan is also considered the sports center of Russia. They held some sports games. They've built a lot of stadia. And I found a lot of shops So I saw this one with the Toronto Maple Leafs. I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if I could get a Vancouver Canucks sweater that's half English and half Russian? Vancouver who? Canucks. Vancouver Canucks? No. Niet. They're very proud of this. This is the pyramid. And it is one of these entertainment centers with a variety of activities inside. And again, just some photos of people ask me, how do you describe the architectural character? And I don't know, but it is certainly energetic, and both the old buildings and some of the new buildings. But one of the most remarkable structures I saw was this. And I love not only the vitality of it, but also the message. This was an individual, local philanthropist, who decided to build a temple where everybody could pray together. As he said, all 13 religions of the world. And it is interesting, that's right. And if you look in detail, you will see that there's a Star of David, and there's 13 mosques, or 13 peaks, cupolas to celebrate the 13 religions. And it really is, I think, quite a wonderful notion. In fact, in Tatarstan, I realized things were a bit different when in my room there was a direction to Mecca. It's about 55% Muslim, and there's I'm told, a fairly reasonable level of religious harmony. So for those of you who want to see some more housing, some of the new condominium developments, to me it looks a lot like the stuff Ray Letkeman's been doing up at Whistler. The client for this competition was called Unistroy. Now in English, Unistroy is not a particularly good name for a developer, but in Russian it seems to work much better. And this is the kind of development that they've typically been doing, these large scale. They think of them as communities, not buildings. But I did go around and look at some of their buildings, and there's a lot of this, although they have been experimenting lately with low-rise buildings. And so this is a site plan on the site of their latest low-rise development. And that site plan certainly has a degree of regimentality that perhaps you wouldn't get approved even in Surrey or Richmond. Well, maybe Richmond, you could get that in Richmond. In fact, the next time you fly into Vancouver, just look at some of the townhouse developments in Richmond. They're not that dissimilar. But again, building these developments with the childcare facilities coming in very early on, and this is how they look when they're finished. But I apologize, these are not great photographs, but I said to them, there's two things that bother me here. One is, why don't the grade level suites have direct access to a little private space? Oh, they said, do you do that? I immediately showed them pictures of what we do. The other thing I said is, why are you putting the gas lines on the outside of the building? Oh, they said, it's much safer. And I said, surely it's not much safer. In Canada, we don't put all the gas lines on the outside of the building. We put them on the inside of the building. And you don't hear about people being blown up all the time. So they're going to review that, but they assured me that the norm regulations require the gas lines to go on the outside. I also said, no, I don't want to be rude, but I think you need to rethink your corridor design. Really? They said, our corridor design is very durable. I said, yes, it is durable. It's a little too durable. So I've been taking photographs now of corridors and different types of developments, which I'm taking back to them. But I don't want to, I'm joking a bit. I have to tell you that the people I am meeting are really very impressive in their desire to want to do better and better things. And they are working with architects from all over the world. And it's not just at the developer level, even the government. And I found this statement online. And the reason it's in Russian as well is because I shared it with the students at Kazan State University. But basically what it is saying is that they want to design, they use the term comfortable communities, but sustainable doesn't really translate very well, but they mean communities livable. I said livable is the word you might want to use. But anyway, in Kazan, another organization like Strelka organized a competition. This one is by an agency for the Strategic Development Center. And this guy, Sergei Georgievsky, is a very impressive guy. And he's traveling around with a group of very bright young people organizing competitions. And it got me thinking, you know, we don't really do a lot of competitions in Vancouver. And I must admit, I went to the Moscow International Center competition with a certain cynicism. And indeed, when we were going around the table introducing ourselves, and of course everything was done, excuse me, in English and in translated, I tried to tell a story, which I believe to be a true story, when Vancouver had the public library competition. And they shortlisted 3 teams, and James Cheng, you were one of them, if I'm not mistaken, and Tom was coordinating the competition. And one of the teams was Barry Downs and Moishe Safdie. And I'm told that when they sat down for their first design session, Barry said he felt it was very important that the new library have some of the memory of the old library. And Moishe said, just a second, Barry. We're not here to design a library. We're here to win a competition. And the rest of that story is, as you may recall, the models went on display and the public played a role. And of course, people loved the idea of a Colosseum because they're not architects. And at the end, Moishe apparently said to Gordon Campbell, who was the mayor at the time, well, now we'll sit down and we can start to design a library. And Gordon Campbell said, no, you are going to build it exactly the way you showed it to the public. And some of you know the rest of that story, but basically that's what happened. But the competitions here are really quite well done. For instance, on this particular competition, it was open. It was closed. 31 firms were invited. Out of that, we shortlisted to 11, and then we shortlisted to 3, and the 3 were given money, not 200,000 euros, more like 200,000 rubles, but they were given some money. But in between the time they were shortlisted and the time they submitted their final designs, there were a number of regular meetings with the client. And so that way they didn't go off cock on the wrong idea. They were generally being directed. I mean, the client, and I was brought in to these in-between sessions. I actually ended up doing them by Skype, which I said I would happily do until I realized there's an 11-hour time difference between Kazan. So I sat there at 2:30 and 3:30 in the morning, looking, trying to be articulate, but anyway, whoops. One of the interesting things was this team had organized another competition. And I like this line. An important goal of this competition is the search of modern interpretation of Tatar identity by architectural means. And I thought that was quite nice. So this is some insight into the Malya Kabani competition, and I will make a confession. When I agreed to do it, I didn't realize I was actually the chair of the jury, and I was the only non-Russian member of the jury. But it was a wonderful experience, and my fellow jurors were some very interesting people. And I will share this, it got down to 2 firms from 2 different countries, and we couldn't really decide. And the lady next to me, a prominent architect in Russia, she said, in Russian of course, I feel like I'm being asked to judge an ice skating competition and choose between artistic merit and technical merit. And I thought, isn't that lovely? Now, if we had more time, I would take you through this in detail, but what this is really talking about the Russian norms and regulations in terms of how far different facilities can be from one another. And I think it's quite fascinating. I mean, we do some of this in our smart growth documentation and so forth. But for instance here, again, children's playgrounds, sports pitch, leisure areas, how far the kindergarten should be and how many spaces per 1,000 residents, how far the area to walk your dog should be from the residential units and so forth. And so there's a whole matrix as part of the norms that have been packaged. And I recommend that the architects look at them, because I'm not suggesting one should follow them, but I think they might inspire some other kind of thinking in terms of how we design livable communities. So I would like to just finish this portion with some images that just came out of this competition from the Dutch team. And of course, it's very important to think about what it looks like in the summer, but also what it looks like in the winter. An English team. I mean, again, there's a certain style to European architecture these days. I mean, I've got books and books up here, if you want to come and look afterwards, of the work submitted by the Dutch and Danish and Norwegian teams. And there's a crispness, a boxiness to everything. But, and the Spanish team, a very impressive team. But I think one of the interesting things about this whole competition, and we discussed it, is that the client is brave, and we did select one of the teams, and they're going to now proceed with the planning, but it will be necessary for the residents to start to change their habits. But I told them that I don't think they need to worry about that, because I told them how we in Vancouver are all becoming Danish. I'd like to tell you about two other initiatives just outside of Kazan. The first is Smart City, and the other is Innopolis. And Smart City is a whole new town on a site very close to the site that was the subject of the competition that I was involved with. But unfortunately, given what's happening in Russia and also what's happening in the rest of the world, the financing has not been realized for this development, which would have a mix of high-tech offices, housing, recreational amenities, and so forth. However, Innopolis is underway. And it was quite interesting. I just got an email, and it said, the mayor of Innopolis wants to meet you. And to be honest, when I looked at it, I thought it said the mayor of Indianapolis. And I thought, well, I'd be happy to meet him, but not just now. So I Googled Innopolis and discovered it's a new city being created about 50 kilometers from downtown Kazan. But unlike Smart City, this one really is underway. And it's not just offices and housing, it's also a university. And unfortunately, I was there in the evening, so I didn't get any pictures, so I'm just using some file photos here. But the buildings are really quite attractively designed, and the housing is quite lively, and indeed, you know, as one of the things I saw there that I hadn't seen anywhere else were new townhouse developments, not unlike the kind of townhouses that we're building. And it's worth going online, and there's videos, and I think you'll all be quite impressed with this whole new town that's being created. But the other side of it that intrigued me is the university. It's not a government university, it's a private university, and there's no tuition. And the reason there's no tuition is because it's entirely financed by the top high-tech companies in Russia. The mayor of the town used to be in high-tech, and he invented what they refer to as the Russian iPhone. And what makes it special, Yota, is that it has screens on both sides. And one of my Facebook friends, one of my snarky Facebook friends, said, why do you need a screen on both sides? So I said, one's for English and one's for Russian. But I did wonder, why do you need a screen? But I'm sure, you know, some people have two computers. But I was given a presentation on what this university is doing and how it's affiliating itself with a number of universities around the world. And I noticed at the bottom right, there's a blank. There's no one from Canada, although there are 2 professors on staff. And the reason there's 2 Canadian professors on staff is because the entire university curriculum is given in English. So it's quite fascinating. So I'm going to suggest to SFU that we should investigate an affiliation with this institution, because I think it really is. It's referred to as the future tech capital of Russia. And I thought it was very impressive. Anyway, it's almost time to wind up, so I'd like to just finish off with a few things that I couldn't help but photograph and share with you. Can you imagine saying to your friends, let's go to this lounge tonight? For those of you at the back, it's the Snob Lounge Bar. And I shared this with someone and they said, it's very Russian. I thought this was interesting. I'm becoming obsessed with pedestrian safety, especially as I get older. So on the top there, this is in Saint Petersburg, and I don't know how often this is done, where they've literally embedded colored lights into the sidewalk to let you know when to cross and when not to cross. I thought that was much more elegant than what you see in London with all those little pasty white signs saying look both ways, which is actually helpful advice in London. But the other thing just below it, those are the doors to a washroom. And instead of having a little thing that says occupied, vacant, the handles light up red and green. I thought that was kind of interesting. When I went to Russia, one of the things I was really keen to see was all the ladas. I'm sure in many parts of Russia there are still a lot of ladas, but not where I was. In fact, if you look closely at that Porsche, you will realize, or you may realize, that that's not the reflection of some buildings. That whole car has been wrapped. That's the latest thing. They wrap these cars with all sorts of designs. And it's not just Porsches, of course. There's other cars. Those 2 Hummers were the cars that were provided for our use in Moscow when we went out to do a site tour. And I wanted to say to them, I refuse to get into one of these. But there's other cars. Some people have Range Rovers, or should I say had Range Rovers. And if you want to know what happened here, I suggest you read Once Upon a Time in Russia, or Red Notice, or any of these other books about the life of the oligarchs and the wealthy in Russia. And you understand why when you go to a very nice nightclub, there's all these guys standing outside with shaven heads and little bits of plastic in their ears, because a lot of people have bodyguards in Russia, and that's still there. One of the things that I became interested in when I started working at SFU was car share. I used to think of it as a fringe thing, and now I thought of it as a real thing, and we put it in place up at SFU. So I asked them, do you have car share here in Russia? And this was the response. But I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that in the back okay? If not, it says, we've shared enough in our past. We don't want to now start sharing cars. But I think it's just a matter of time, because it's going to happen. But again, the danger of a presentation like this is I'm being a bit one-sided, and I'm not really showing you everything you see. But you do see old women sitting in the street trying to make a living out of selling a few vegetables. Or this lady who is selling herring. And I love herring, but I just didn't want to start buying it there. Another thing I noticed, and I don't know how common this is, but this is sort of guerrilla street advertising, right? And some of it's quite elaborate. So when I was preparing this presentation, I thought, cuff.ru, I wonder what it is. So I went online over the weekend, and it's like ear jewelry. So there's an idea, for all the jewelry designers in the room, because do they do this in Canada? Yes? Yes? I've never seen it. One of the problems I had in Russia is that I like to smile. It's a sickness, but I know that I smile too much. In Russia, they think people who smile a lot are idiots, and they don't smile. And if you ever use the metro, the reason this lady on the left was the employee of the month is because she looks exactly the way the employee of the month should look. But just to break down a couple of other myths, on the left, in Kazan, that's the property damage price list. So if you break a small plate of 26 centimeters, 200 rubles. And I said to my host, is this common? Is this a joke? No, they said they used to do it a lot more in the restaurants. They don't do it so much now. But it's an interesting country that you need to give people with their menu a list of price list of if you break it. Bike share is coming. I think it's going to be one of the great ironies that Moscow will get bike share before Vancouver. Because they don't have a helmet law, and they've got the Bank of Moscow there as a sponsor. Actually, these bikes were brought in by the Moscow Urban Forum to Saint Petersburg, and after all of our speeches and everything and drinking, we then went off and we were invited to use the bike share. So, I mean, again, I think it tells you something. The country is changing. And the bottle, those of you who wanted to know how much is vodka, this is not the most expensive nor the least expensive. It's close to the least expensive. So at around 260 rubles, $4 or $5 for a bottle of vodka. You can get it for less, but it's harsh. So the bottom left there, that's from the bank window. This week, mortgages are 12%. I thought it was quite clever how they did the floor plan of the building as the price tag. And of course, the hotels, again, just not all the hotels, but just starting to put up their eco-hotel certification. It's changing. It's just starting, but it is starting. And in the bottom right, of course, Mr. Putin. Lots of T-shirts, so I figured I started with him. Let me finish with him. Last week's Moscow Times, the truth behind the number being 86%. Why doesn't Putin's rating budge? If you want to know, I brought a copy of the Moscow Times, and you can read it. One of the most remarkable things is he does, at least is reported to enjoy this very, very high level of popularity. Anyway, it's time to put on your coats. I had to show at least one piece of wonderful art, and I thought it was fantastic. So it was exactly 1 week ago today, I looked out over this room. This was the students at Kazan State University, and they were piled out of the corridor, and apparently it was videotaped and will be online. And I presented more about what's happening in Vancouver, but I did share with them some of my observations about Russia. I did tell them to do something about those corridors and those pipes hanging on the outside of buildings and those highly regimented landscape plans and so forth. And it was a very gratifying experience. So just as I thank them for coming to learn about Vancouver, let me conclude by thanking all of you for coming to learn about Russia.